Welcome back. I decided to switch spots. I just got in from a dog walk and I was just, it's really bad out there. It's like miserable. And I thought, yesterday I talked about, where I was, and I was going to try to show you that room over there, but it's too light with the camera, and then Chip was sleeping over there, but this is basically the other room downstairs. I also wanted to say something before I start chapter 4, and that is, yesterday I quoted Garrison Keillor and Woody Allen, and we don't do that anymore. And I also mentioned my friend Gladys and said her blue Eskimo eyes, and that's how Gladys self-identifies. She's an Aleut with blue eyes, Native Alaskan Aleut, and she always calls herself a blue-eyed Eskimo. So I didn't mean that in any way to be disrespectful. And like I said, Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs was written, between the time frame is 2005 to 2008 or 9 or so. So it came out in 2010. So it's really a window in time. And I don't want to correct all those things every time I go through. And it's funny, after reading yesterday, I had just a terrible day. I think it's the whole pandemic, and reading that story was hard, and it always is. And then, last night, then John Prine died, and I was like, you have got to be kidding me. And it sort of unleashed. But I felt really comforted by his music, by his songs. When I Get to Heaven is a really good song. And the one I was just whistling, Fish and Whistle, Father, forgive us for what we must do. You forgive us, we'll forgive you. We'll forgive each other till we both turn blue. Then we'll whistle and go fishing in heaven. And I think right now, a lot of us are forgiving people or thinking about other people and trying to be extra tender. So I'm going to work on being more positive today. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to check the news all day. I'm just not going to have it on, because I think I get so sad when I see it, or I get angry, and it's just not good. I think I'll just wait until it comes on the radio this evening or something, but I'm not going to be clicking and checking. So, chapter 4, Namaste, and the epigraph in front of this one is, you are no longer strangers and sojourners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. And that's from Ephesians 2:19. The good news is that a year after my accident, I was able to walk, hike, and even run again. Before I could jog, though, I started attending yoga classes. At the very end of each class, the instructor, Mandy Ramsey, who has long blonde hair and the sweetest soul you'll ever meet, as well as the most flexible body, puts her hands together as if she's praying, tucks them right next to her heart, and says, Namaste. And we all respond with the same gesture and word, Namaste. For weeks after I began the class, I had no idea what it meant, but did it anyway, because everyone else did. When in yoga, do as the yogis do. This may have been a mistake during the partner part of one class when a man I didn't know at the time, he's a retired lawyer who recently moved to Haines, had to hold my legs on his shoulders while my head stayed on the floor. Instead of giving me a fine stretch like it was supposed to do, the whole thing felt more like a cross between some sort of weird sex game and the wheelbarrow races on the 4th of July. The kind in which one person holds the feet of another person who runs with her hands across the grass in Clinkett Park. But that was the worst of it. Mostly, doing as the yogis did was all wonderful, and it left me feeling light in body and soul. And I still do yoga, and we've been doing Zoom yoga with Mandy, which is a whole nother thing, but it's good right now. Yoga takes place Tuesday and Thursday evenings in the Chilkat Center Dance Studio, upstairs in the old cannery building where our Episcopal Church also meets. Sometimes the way we stretch and think in yoga reminds me of church. Jan Hatzi, our vicar, doesn't come to yoga, but one Sunday she talked about the term Namaste, quoting Joan Chichester's book, The Rule of Benedict. Vicar is an old-fashioned Episcopal word that basically means a priest who isn't paid. Our congregation does provide Jan a small stipend, but she makes her living as a substance abuse counselor for the Haines and Cluckwan clinics. She still spends a good deal of time preparing her sermons. Anyway, Jan told us that Chichester writes that Namaste means the divine in me greets the divine in you, or the Holy Spirit in me touches the Holy Spirit in you. She said that when we encounter people in our life and work, we should try to be on the alert for Holy Spirits trying to reveal themselves, and that Christians should, as Chichester writes, acknowledge the gifts of God that the other person brings to the meeting, whether they are a friend or stranger, arriving or departing. The other spiritual stretch that happens at the end of every yoga class is that we lie down on our backs on thick pads with hands crossed on our chests and a warm wool blanket pulled up to our chins. It's called the corpse pose. We rest this way for a few minutes until 3 bells ring. Then we roll over on our sides, pull our knees up into the birth pose, a fetal position, and wait there a long moment before sitting up, putting our hands together at our hearts and saying Namaste to honor the place of light and love and truth inside one another. The place Mandy says is where the universe lives in all of us. We die and are reborn twice a week. It's pretty darn symbolic, especially for someone like me who thinks too much about life and death anyway. It does make dying less scary, though, when you practice it for a few minutes each week. I was missing yoga class and thinking about what Jan said in church as I re-entered Alaska after a busy week in LA with my daughter JJ, then a high school senior, and as now a runner. I was missing home too, although it was great to see JJ run in a regional cross-country race, take her to the J. Paul Getty Museum, visit some possible colleges, and drive around Hollywood. I also spent a lot of time gripping a steering wheel with all my might and praying we wouldn't die in a terrible crash. It wasn't until I was safely home that the Guy Clark lyrics, "If I can just get off of this LA freeway without getting killed," finally quit running through my head. It's what songs do, and I think that's why we were so connected to John Prine, don't you? And we still can be, and so that's something to hold on to right now if you're sad. Technically, I wasn't home yet, but I was in Juneau and back on familiar turf, actually decking, of the northbound ferry for Haines. It was December, and I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised that I would receive the first gift of the season on that boat. It's funny, too, that now I'm reading this. This took place in December, and we are having a wicked snowstorm out here. It might as well be December, and in fact, it was probably one of the hardest dog walks I've ever been on. It must be going 60 out there, and it's snowing and raining, and we've got a winter storm happening here, even though it's April 8th, all the way till 4 o'clock today. It's unbelievably bad. The power already went out once this morning, so I hope it doesn't go out again. Anyway, it was dark then and cold. 5 degrees is especially biting in damp Juneau. When JJ and I lifted our bags onto a luggage cart, one of the 2 open double-decker trailers pulled by a small tractor that resembles a toy train. It was packed with boxes of Christmas presents, duffel bags, suitcases, coolers of groceries, infant car seats, all kept secure by only a vinyl curtain and the honesty of our fellow travelers. We hustled down the metal boat ramp and onto the brightly lit car deck where crew members in insulated coveralls exhaled clouds of steam as their mittened hands directed the drivers of cars and trucks to parking spaces. When we dashed into the heated stairwell and climbed the steep stairs up to the main deck and headed down the long windowed hall to the cafeteria. Though it was quiet at 6 a.m., familiar faces greeted us from the few occupied tables. The wraparound windows were still black, reflecting what was inside, rather than bringing in the outside views of Auk Bay with its forested shore and rocky islands. The food service line wouldn't open for another hour, but there was hot water and ferry coffee available. My friend Beth was there with a camping coffee kit, fresh ground beans and a drip cone filter, and offered to brew me a cup. She even had a thermos of half and half. Once the strong coffee jump-started us, we fell into a happy discussion about the birth of her grandson. Beth and her husband had left Haines back at Halloween and had taken the ferry all the way to Bellingham and then driven to San Francisco to be there for the baby's arrival. The trip cost about the same as flying, she said, but was so much nicer. What a difference traveling by ship is from those traffic-filled LA freeways. It's why I hope they never build a road between Haines and Juneau along the Lynn Canal. It's much more pleasant to eat, drink, walk around, and visit with friends and worry about traffic, icy roads, or getting killed in avalanches. Later, when we arrived home, my weather-watching neighbor, Betty Holgate, told me that, according to the Weather Service's remote control gauges, it was blowing 35 knots from the north with gusts to 60 at Eldred Rock Lighthouse when our ferry went by. But while on board, we plowed confidently into the steamy gale. There was some rolling and a few shudders as the heavy ship surged through the waves, but the cafeteria was mostly steady. The 400-foot navy blue-hulled Malaspina is, as are all the state ferries, named for a glacier. It is more than 40 years old and is one of the original Alaskan ferries that make up what we call the Alaska Marine Highway, a waterway connecting the roadless communities of southeast Alaska. This is kind of sad to read right now because our current administration in Alaska is pretty much gutting the ferries. And we went through a period this winter where for 6 weeks there wasn't one that was working. And the big ships have all been dry docked, they're broken, the new ones don't work. It's really kind of an epic fail. And the coastal communities are all feeling it. And so we're rallying and doing the best we can, but the ferries are anything but as reliable as they were when I wrote this then. And then I wrote, I like to think of her as our Queen Mary, only more democratic. There's no first class. Everyone on this boat travels in the same pretty good class. During breakfast, Beth and I chatted and then kept on chatting about everything big and small, from hens to Jesus. Beth is the kind of vegetarian who eats eggs. I keep chickens. She leans mostly toward the Buddhist philosophy for her inspiration, although she says she thinks of herself as someone who embraces the tenets of love and compassion that are found in most religions. I'm pretty Christian, or as Christians as Episcopalians are, which means I go to church and I pray and believe, or try to, but do not, as my more evangelical friends do, preface my opinions with, I'm a Christian. Beth, and once I was on a board of the public radio station, and we were talking about programming for the Christian community, and there was a complaint. Somebody was at the meeting, and they said, well, there's no, you don't even have any Christians on your board. And so then I said, well, I am. And everybody went, what? So anyway, that's kind of where I'm at. So let me keep going here. Beth, excuse me. Beth did attend a service at San Francisco's Glide Memorial Church when she was down there, and said that if we had a similar church in Haines, she would go more often. Glide's mission is to battle poverty, drug abuse, violence, and prejudice with the unconditional love of Jesus. They also provide job training and help people find employment. And they offer lots of free meals and health care. In Haines, there isn't any one place that does all that. We all do, often in little and less public displays of charity, like the way my family received all those casseroles when I was hurt, or the way Beth, in her work at Hospice of Haines, makes sure the elderly and ill can stay at home to die. Beth has been and continues to be instrumental in the operation of the local hospice. As so often happens, Beth and I went from being saints to sinners seamlessly, jumping from praising the noble mission of Glide Memorial one minute to criticizing an ornery newcomer to Haines who wrote a belligerent there's a lot of big words in here. I can't believe I wrote them. Let me try that again. We went from saints and sinners jumping from praising the noble mission of Glide Memorial 1 minute to criticizing an ornery newcomer to Haines, who wrote a belligerent letter to the editor of the Chilkat Valley News the next. I said I hoped he would move back to wherever he came from. Beth decided she would shower the combative letter writer's house with thoughts of love and happiness each time she drove or walked by it. Then she lifted her arms and wiggled her fingers like a shaman, and we laughed. Beth made more coffee, and we talked about colleges. JJ and I had been looking at schools with good cross-country running programs. Beth had been a marathon runner when she was younger and attended graduate school at the University of Oregon. Thinking about those days prompted her to talk about a friend of hers, an Olympic sprinter, who had been killed by a sniper. Beth was waiting at a cafe near campus where they were supposed to meet for lunch when he was gunned down by a crazy man outside the college stadium. A woman from the local hospice had helped Beth make it through those days right afterward. She had found Beth's house, knocked on her door, and then that stranger said she was there to help her grieve. That's how Beth was introduced to the organization that would become her life's calling. She sipped her coffee, and we were both quiet a minute. I was thinking about JJ going off to college and snipers, and suddenly I felt so sad. Beth said that her father, a hunter, had told her later that if her sprinter friend had run off in a zigzag pattern instead of a straight line, he probably would not have been shot dead. Then they would still be friends. Then she could send him a card with a photo of the new grandbaby and a cheerful "time flies" note. I turned to JJ and I told her to remember the zigzag part if she's ever in a place where someone starts shooting. JJ rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, Mom, that will never happen." But it does, and it did, and it will again, I wanted to say. Read the paper, watch TV, listen to the radio. It happens every day somewhere. Maybe Al should mention this bullet-dodging maneuver in the next safety report. This is weird how prescient that is, or I don't know what it was, not prescient, that's not the right word, but that I wrote about this back then when JJ was in high school, and she's an elementary school principal now, and just had her first child. Amelia Ann was born March 16th in Juneau, and I was there to cut the cord. It all happened just before all of this. But as an elementary school principal, JJ now conducts live shooter drills with little children. My grandchildren know about this zigzag maneuver and hiding under a desk. Ugh. Thinking about so much real and potential loss prompted me to tell Beth about my first hospice client. I wanted to call her friend because that is what she became. But at hospice, we call the people we read to or help to the bathroom or make lunch for clients. Even though Haines is small, we do our best to keep the clients' names and who is caring for them confidential. I'm on the hospice board. My editor, Tom, jokes that I become involved so I'd have a heads up on obituaries. And I had planned to start the volunteer training on the weekend I was run over by the truck. I took it the following spring, and I was able to use it to help my mother die and my father, I hope, deal with her death. Before all that happened, though, I wasn't sure I was ready to be a hospice volunteer. I do know that following my accident and my mother's death, I was certainly better prepared for hospice work. My first hospice client was scheduled to leave town in a couple of days. She was moving into an extended care facility in Anchorage in order to be closer to family there. She'd grown up here and had graduated from Haines High, but for the past 15 years or so had worked for several small Alaskan airlines and as a deckhand on a fishing boat based in a tiny village near Sitka. A hiker and a skier, she had worked in a mostly male industry and was used to pulling crab pots, baiting hooks, and reeling in fish on decks pelted with cold rain and big swells. She was tough and fit. Then a backache turned out to be lung cancer. In early summer, she had moved home to Haines to put her affairs in order. By October, she was on oxygen and unable to leave her apartment. My instructions were to check in and spend about half hour a day running errands for her and perhaps make some rice pudding, as she was having trouble keeping food down. Her place was sparse. It looked as though someone was moving out. There were taped boxes against a wall, a few neat stacks of books on the floor, yesterday's newspaper, a lamp, table, and a couple of chairs. The first time I went over, the building's manager was replacing damaged siding. It was raining so hard that he was working under blue vinyl tarps. One blocked my client's window, and she told me that the hammering and the flapping wind and the machine gun rain on the tarp were driving her nuts. You know, it sounds so formal calling her my client or even my friend. So would it be okay if I call her Marion? That's not her real name, but I think she'd like it, since she loved to read and could sing like the librarian called Marion in The Music Man, and using it will not violate the hospice privacy rule. So, Marion's apartment was dark and noisy. The tarps gave the place a blue hue. It was also hot, and an oxygen machine hummed underneath all that construction clatter and strafing rain. And it was full of cigarette smoke, which I thought was odd. Marion was lying down and reading in a sleeping bag on the floor, pillows propped all around her. Her nest, she called it. The floor felt better on her back than the futon she had been sleeping on. That day, Marion didn't stand up. She handed me written instructions for the grocery store and post office, her mailbox number and key, and the store perks card. She pointed to where everything was, her living will, her insurance papers, her sister's phone number. Marion was organized and completely matter-of-fact about her imminent death, making sure her bills were paid, letters were mailed, and belongings were packed so that when she died, her friends and family wouldn't have too much work to do. She even had a suitcase ready with overnight needs in the event of an emergency medevac. Marion was 57 years old and had been told she had 5 months to live, tops. Turns out she didn't leave for the Anchorage Extended Care Facility as she had planned. There were glitches with the admitting paperwork and concerns about taking a commercial flight. I half wished she wouldn't go at all, that maybe she'd just die here. I say half because, of course, I really didn't want her to die. I'd taken to calling her before I went to bed each night and again while I made my coffee in the morning. Then I'd head over to see her a few hours later. Some days she was barely able to talk. Others, she was up and eating yogurt and smoking a cigarette at the table. One morning, Marion asked if I thought she was insane to still be smoking. I didn't tell her that I didn't like smoke, or that I had a separate change of clothes just for my visits with her, or that each day when I left there, I went for a walk, a long walk in the woods, drinking in the fresh air like a cold glass of well water. Instead, I said that I had never been in her position, and the last thing I was going to do was judge her. I tried not to cry. Marion laughed, a deep, raspy FM radio late-night DJ kind of laugh, and said smoking was stupid and I should damn well say so and not be such a wuss. She was going to quit when her current pack was empty. We worked at her high school yearbook, and Marion told me about all the friends of hers. We looked at her high school yearbook, and Marion told me all about friends of hers back then, many of whom had stayed in Haines and are now friends of mine. She had spent the first half of her life in Haines, and I'd spent the second half, and so we filled each other in on the missing years. In school, she had been a singer and an actress. We filled each other in on the missing years, and that's the name of, that John Prine album. And I don't know, it's interesting how life just rolls right around like a big old wheel, isn't it? It really is. It's a big old goofy world. He's right. In school, Marion had been a singer and an actress. She said she was sorry she missed the Lynn Canal Community Players production of The Music Man and then sang all about trouble in River City. She had a great voice. She also had an auto harp and a clarinet near her nest bed, which she apparently played when I wasn't there. Our days together turned into a week, and then a week turned into 2 and 3. Some days I thought I couldn't be in that smoky apartment another minute. Others, I wanted to stay all afternoon. While Marion was preparing for death, I was preparing for winter. I went hunting again for the first time since my accident, high on a cliffy ridge above the Chilkat River. When Chip shot a mountain goat, the gully where it fell was so steep that we couldn't move it without falling further ourselves or risking losing it altogether in another tumble. So we skinned and boned the goat right there. Crampons kept my heels on the sedge-covered slope. The alarming angle made my position more of a lean against a wall than a seat on the ground. The views were breathtaking. I know that's a cliche, but they were. The wide, braided Chilkat River Valley and the spruce and hemlock forested foothills, the brown, red, and golden tundra meadows, the rock and gravel benches, and finally the glacial peaks that made up the mountains all around us. We were so high up and it was so steep that if I turned around to grab the plastic sheet I'd packed to clean the goat on, I would have slipped and fallen. I had to debone the heavy hind quarters right on my lap, and blood leaked all over my jacket and pants. I couldn't help but think about another time when I'd had blood on my jacket and pants. I thought about my own bones and flesh as I touched that goat's pelvis and hip bones. The muscle and nerves and sinews that had held him together were so much like mine. I thought about all of that, but not for too long, since there was a lot of work to do. I've done this enough now that I am skilled at it, but I remain surprised that I can cut warm flesh off bone. I'm not sure how or when it happened that I became steady enough to traverse steep ridges and skin just-killed animals. In some ways, it's not much different from the kind of courage it takes to change a stranger's bedpan or help a dying person bathe. It can be done, it really can, by ordinary people. A few days later, my body was still sore from the effort of the climb and the pack, and my heart hurt too, because my friend Marion was becoming worse, and honestly, because hunting is hard and it hurts your heart sometimes. I have really mixed feelings about it. My husband is a hunter, and I love going with him, and I appreciate the meat, which here we're not big farmers, you know. But I'm not a killer. I can't shoot anything. And I mean, I can shoot, and I've practiced just to be on the safe side, but I don't. I just can't do that. Anyway, Marion was becoming worse. She slept more and talked less. She needed more painkillers. She made fewer lists. She told me the only painting on her wall, a watercolor, should go to her sister. One morning we talked about what she wanted in her obituary, and she showed me the photo she had chosen to run with it. It looked like her, only with hair and sparkle. I had known Marion only when she was bald and frail. She had been a stunningly attractive woman. She also told me that she wanted a memorial plaque down in Pelican, the village where she had lived and fished. The tiny boardwalk community on a rocky outcrop doesn't have a cemetery, but it does have a gazebo with bronze burial plaques. Each holds up to 3 lines with 10 characters each. Thinking about what to put in the lines reminded me of writing a haiku. It was harder than you'd think. Marion took a break and lit a cigarette. She hadn't quit when the last pack ran out. She was smoking more, and there was a carton of menthol lights on my new grocery list. Again, she said, "You probably think I'm crazy not to quit." I said she was the bravest person I had ever known. Marion listened to the radio but didn't have a computer or a TV and couldn't make it to the library to read the news she craved online. Part of my caregiving was to buy her the daily papers from Anchorage and Juneau. In the summer, you could sometimes get the Tuesday papers on Tuesday, but in stormy October and November, we're lucky to have them flown into Haines at all. One Thursday, while we were reading the Sunday papers in her now quiet apartment, the construction was finished, the rain had turned to snow, and the blinds were closed to keep the bright whiteness out. We talked about a whole section devoted to the release of Into the Wild, the movie set in Alaska and directed by Sean Penn. Neither of us had seen the film. We don't have a theater here yet, so we had to wait for the DVD to watch it. Marion didn't live that long. But we both had read John Krakauer's book of the same name about Chris McCandless wasting away and dying in that bus out in the bushes, and we were curious about the reviews. Many of our fellow Alaskans' responses to the film were scathing and cruel, and not so much directed at the movie itself, but rather the subject, its boy hero. But I felt differently. I agree with every Alaskan I know, and I bet everyone you do too, that Chris McCandless was foolishly unprepared. It bothers me that Marion will have a small plaque and he has a book and now a movie that apparently treats him like a latter-day Thoreau. Chris McCandless walked into the Alaskan wilderness planning on spending months alone with just 10 pounds of rice and a .22. 100 years ago, a typical Klondike gold seeker brought 200 pounds of rice and a bigger gun. In Haines and nearby Skagway, 14 miles up Taya Inlet from here, and where most of the miners began their hikes into the Canadian Yukon Territory and on up to Bonanza Creek and Dawson City, even grade schoolers know that the Mounties wouldn't let anyone into the backcountry who didn't have a ton of supplies, a full year's provisions. A real ton, including 400 pounds of flour, dried fruit, tools, sleds, cookware, and cabin-sized wall tents with wood stoves. Some even hauled materials to build boats. The Into the Wild critics up here, though, don't seem to acknowledge that everyone may not be able to be quite that prepared. I have 5 children, so I'm also well aware that you can't always convince kids to take care of themselves. And I know from reading the book that the young man was troubled. Maybe what really bothers me most about the barbed comments is the declaimer's inability to see that Chris McCandless was a real person, a genuine lost soul. Sure, we may think he made mistakes, but calling him an idiot for being so naive is a little like calling Marion stupid for smoking. There's truth, and then there's the whole truth. There is now a bronze memorial plaque in that abandoned junker bus where he died, too, on that washed-out road 30 miles from anywhere. It memorializes him as a beloved son. When his parents hiked in, or maybe four-wheeled or snowmobiled in, to see for themselves where their boy had died of starvation, they brought the plaque with them and installed it there in his memory. And this is really important to remember. His mother left something else behind, too, a small suitcase of survival gear, so this would not happen to another woman's son who, for whatever reason, may call that bus home or stumble on it during a wilderness trek. She put in a first aid kit, map, blankets, and a can of tuna fish in that suitcase. To the first person who needs it, that suitcase will be like a gift from God. The divine in her will meet the divine in a stranger. Namaste. When we were struggling to figure out what to say on Marion's plaque, the 3 lines that the world will remember her best by, she quoted Woody Allen, joking that she didn't want to live in my or anyone else's memory. She'd prefer her own apartment. I thought about that and how glad I was to be returning home and how important my own well-stocked house is to me, while Beth and I sat in the dining room of the northbound ferry talking about life and death, and especially Marion. I said that I wished more than anything in the world that she hadn't smoked, that she hadn't had lung cancer, that she hadn't died. I told Beth that Marion and I had talked about death in the way I hoped my mother and I could have, but never did. I told her how I thought I was volunteering to help a dying person, but that in lots of ways she had helped me more than I helped her because she was so frank, so willing to let me help, so close to whatever there is on the other side of this life. Marion had the kind of spirit that was a comfort to glimpse, even as it was leaving her. Beth said I was lucky, just like Chip said I was lucky in that wheelchair. You know, sometimes I wish I weren't quite so lucky. We were still talking quietly and more seriously now when we realized that the cafeteria was empty. The ferry had docked in Haines, and my, thank goodness, very healthy friend Joanne, who works at the ferry terminal, selling tickets and securing ships to the big old pilings, The same friend who had helped make sure I didn't die that day on the road next to her house was down on the dock in her life vest tying up our boat. Beth embraced me as we parted. She didn't say Namaste, but she might as well have. And Marion wrote her own obituary. In the end, I couldn't even do that for her. She was a good writer. The details were sharp. She wrote that she was, quote, a precocious child who learned to read at the age of 3. Writing of herself in the third person, she noted, despite her discomfort during her illness, she continued to manifest her sense of humor, asking the staff at Providence Hospital in Anchorage, okay, anyone who's surprised I have lung cancer after smoking 3 packs a day for 45 years, raise your hands. Don't be shy. Get those hands up where I can see them. She wrote that in her own obituary. And in lieu of flowers, she requested that donations be made to Hospice of Haines. After the drive from the ferry to our house, I unpacked and cooked my family a nice dinner, setting the table with candles and my mother's china and silver. I was grateful to have so much. Later, when Chip had done all the dishes and gone upstairs to read, and the wood stove was loaded and damped down for the night, I let the dogs out one last time. I like being outside at night. I like hearing the waves meet the shore and the wind in the trees. I like looking at the stars. I sat on the steps in my old wool duffel coat, ski hat, and the mittens Eliza knitted me last Christmas, and found the Pleiades and Orion's belt. I'm fascinated by the night sky, which I suppose is a good thing, since for most of the year Alaska has more of it than anywhere else in the United States. When it's clear, I check on the heavens before I go to bed. I've also bought an astronomy guidebook, and I'm learning about the constellations. So I stared up at all the twinkling lights and celestial smudges for a long, long time. When I saw a shooting star, I made a wish that my children will outlive me. I waited for another star to zip bottle rocket style across the sky. When one did, I wished that Marion was in heaven. I thought about my mother and about Beth's college sprinter who had been shot, and about my accident, and about Chris McCandless's mother and that suitcase. I was getting cold, but still I waited for one more shooting star. When it appeared, I wished for another ordinary day, one just like today, where the divine in me greets the divine in you, both here and gone, and all those others, and all those others, both here and gone, and somehow all mixed up in holy spirits. Namaste. I hope you have a good day today, and I hope it's better than yesterday was for me. And take good care of yourself, and maybe don't check the news every 10 seconds. It might help. And I'll be back with chapter, 5 already? Thanks, for sending me notes, and you can reach me all through the website if you want. It's been really nice to hear from you, and does me well to keep you company. This is some storm. Gotta go.